Hi everyone. Menno and Sophie, are you guys ready? Maybe we could.
Ready as I'll ever be.
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. So hello everyone. Welcome to the AFE INNOVNET webinar. This is our 9th webinar so far. Today it will be about age-friendly buildings and outdoors. So what could help senior citizens to remain active and healthy in the community? Well, according to the World Health Organization, local and regional communities can work on 8 different domains that have a great impact on citizens' lives. One of the 8 domains are outdoor spaces and buildings. So today we welcome 2 speakers, Menno from TNO, who is a senior researcher. He will present some key research findings on the topics. And we have Sophie Handler from the City of Manchester, who will present some implementation in the City of Manchester to become more age-friendly. Time will be dedicated after the presentations for some discussion, some questions. So I invite you to write them down in the chat box. And of course, the material, the PowerPoint presentation will be sent by email and uploaded on the website. I'll give the floor now to Menno. If you're ready, I will put your presentation.
Yes, I'm ready. Thank you.
There you go.
Okay, there's something happening there. That's my presentation. Well, good. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be co-presenting this AFE INNOVNET webinar. Perhaps you've already told the audience who I am, so I don't need to do that. Perhaps just a few words about my organization, TNO. We're the largest Dutch research and innovation organization with around 300 employees. And one of our research priorities is in age-friendly environments, or more broadly in how we can help public and private sector actors to create inclusive and healthy urban and rural living environments. And for us, the age-friendliness and the inclusiveness of living environments is an integral part of any sensible and smart city strategy and program. So that's a way of being a background. We're very proud to be a core partner in the AFE INNOVNET project, where our key task is the development of the repository of evidence-based notable practices. Let's see if the control of the presentation works from here. No, that doesn't seem to be working.
It should work, Menno. You click on the arrows at the bottom.
It was there. Let's see. Oh, right. Oh, those arrows. Sorry, I'm over 40. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Well, brief rundown. What's in store in my part of the talk? Well, no presentation is complete without an introduction, so we're going to be having one. After which I'll be touching very briefly on why it is again that we actually do research and innovation in this field. Speaking of field, it might be useful to define what we actually mean by it, at least for the purposes of this particular talk. And after I've done that, I'll be switching first to some recent issues in established areas of research in age-friendly homes and outdoors, namely ICT and accessibility issues, before turning on to what insights other areas of research like behavioral and lifestyle research and urban and rural planning and policy are bringing to the field. Towards the end of my talk, I'll be turning towards how I think a very important and new field of research, how homes and outdoor environments can be made to act as enabling environments for social networks and meaningful social interaction. And also touch briefly on the sort of research work being done in terms of business models and decision support to help public and private sector actors implement age-friendly solutions at scale. That particular part of the talk, I'm afraid, is going to take us into the somewhat distant future. So to round off, I'd like to have a brief look at what's cooking in Brussels in terms of the short and mid-term innovation agenda you might want to sink your teeth into in a funded way in the near future. So turning to the introduction, this was rather grandly billed as a talk on research findings in age-friendly homes and outdoors. In case you were worrying, I wasn't planning on presenting a lot of complicated graphs and diagrams. For one thing, I don't think that sort of presentation makes for very interesting listening generally, unless you're in a specialized academic conference, and even then you'll find the majority of the audience checking their email while you're talking. So we're going light on the diagrams. That's one reason. So that's one reason. I think the main reason why I want to go light on the diagrams and methodology is because Aidflendy Homes and Outdoors are a subject matter and a research area where you start from what you see happening, what you're experiencing in practice on the ground. Aidflendy Homes and Outdoors isn't a research area where you can sit behind a desk and develop a grand unified theory of everything. The main challenge for researchers in this field is to have a careful look at what's happening on the ground in practice and use your ingenuity to build up a structured understanding of why that seems to be working and how you can transfer that to other contexts and scale it up, provided you're still sober enough to do that, obviously. So that's by way of being an introduction. Turning to why it's actually worth doing research in this field. I'll be brief about this because you probably sort of know this already. One thing is, I mean, look at the Eurostat and OESO figures if you want the exact percentages. But the overall truth is that there's only a small percentage of older people who ever get to see the inside of a nursing home. I think that's a good thing generally. For most older people, living and dying is something that you do at home. And this percentage of people who actually enter institutionalized care is decreasing as we speak, because across Europe there is a policy drive to deinstitutionalize long-term care. And not only that, but also to take long-term care and care for the vulnerable population generally out of the collective domain of formal healthcare and make it more and more responsibility, partly for individual citizens themselves and partly for public sector and private sector actors at local level. Given that populations are aging and the demographic composition of populations is changing, more and more we need to think of the home, conceptualize the home living environment as a self-managed environment for independent living with impairments. And how to do that meaningfully, I think, is the main research challenge we're facing. And that's quite a challenging one. Sorry, wrong button again. Quite a challenging one because our current living environments are not particularly well suited to do that. As socioeconomic developments progress, as technological innovation get implemented, as demographic trends take their course, we see that there's a growing divide between the built environment paradigms, the design paradigms on which our current living environments have been designed, and the needs and preferences of the changing population that actually lives in them. So there's a growing divide that needs to be bridged. And if you then also consider that investments in infrastructure tend to take a long time to materialize, that they are costly, and that the resulting infrastructure is with us for a long time, then it's very sensible to make sure that you get these infrastructure and design decisions as right as you possibly can. So that's by way of briefly highlighting why it was again that this particular field is important. And talking about field, how can we define the field of age-friendly or smart homes and outdoor smart living environments more generally? Well, we could do that very broadly. The topic of age-friendly homes and outdoors is one you can tackle at all sorts of different scale levels, from home components to the world at large. You can sensibly talk about infrastructure effects of changing social and cultural attitudes to aging in place in low and middle income countries. And you can have a very interesting discussion. But for this particular talk, I'd like to limit the scale about which we're talking, your excursions aside, to the level of the neighborhood and below. And there's two reasons for that. One, I've got 30 minutes. And two is that as you grow older, your circle of activity shrinks. And you'll find that for older people generally, for vulnerable people generally, most of your time is actually spent either in the home or in the environment directly around that. So the neighborhood and the components that go to make it up, homes, communal spaces, public spaces, are, if you like, the most natural ecosystem to look at to see if you want to research how you can make living environments more age-friendly. You also, I think that your audience have seen, and I think it's already touched upon by New in her introduction, if you look at initiatives like the WHO Age-Friendly Cities, that should read Global Network of Age-Friendly Cities and Communities, but that wouldn't fit. If you look at the WHO Age-Friendly Environments in Europe, indeed the AFE INNOVNET and the covenant it's trying to put into place, then you'll see that age-friendliness and age-friendly initiatives can address a number of domains. If you look at where the main research drive in age-friendly homes and outdoors is, and it's mostly in the areas of communications and ICT, in housing, and in the design of outdoor and public spaces, naturally. That's not to say that the other domains aren't important, but these three domains are, if you like, the primary research domains. And the other domains are there mostly as domains where we look at to see what sort of effects innovation in these primary domains is having. Traditionally, the effect domain that's been taking pride of place is health and social care. I think part of the innovation and part of the awareness agenda that initiatives like AFE INNOVNET are building is that we need to include in research and analysis also how the living environment, how homes and outdoor spaces are influencing these other domains that go to make up age-friendly environments. Turning to work being done in established research areas. Well, ICT obviously is a research area that's been with us for a long time. I think it's been more than 15 years since we started to see innovation and initiatives in smart home electronics. Obviously, the ambient assisted living, joint programming initiatives have been with us for a long time, as have all sorts of efforts and innovations in e-health, more recently in mobile and wearables-based technologies. So the left side sort of summarizes the current field. If you want to be very honest about it, that current field was running out of steam a little bit in terms of the impact it was having. For smart homes, we were seeing that a lot of effort had gone into developing and designing systems that were built or that were based on fixed computers and hardwired systems, and that failed to predict, how could anyone fail to predict the rise of 4G, 5G, high-speed Wi-Fi, and the ever-presence of tablets and other mobile-based computers. For AAL, a persistent problem is that even though there are initiatives where the private sector is heavily involved, AAL initiatives seem to have persistent trouble in actually bringing their solutions to market. And for e-health and mobile-based health applications, we're seeing that it is difficult for parties involved to actually integrate these solutions into healthcare delivery systems for all sorts of reasons. So it's a good thing that research in this particular area is being revitalized by the fact that the Internet of Things technology revolution, if you want to call it that, is now reaching a level of maturity where it's starting to get ready for scale-up and for large-scale implementation of solutions. A recent report commissioned by the European Commission estimated the current value of the Internet of Things business domain at, I think, around €1 trillion worldwide. So that's a sizable market. And it also estimated that this market would increase sixfold in the period until 2020. And there's a lot of research to be done and a lot of development to be done if you want to see that scale up happening. Because up until now, the Internet of Things has primarily been a technology push domain, which has been dominated by very bright people developing new technologies. And it's only now, as the technologies are being scaled up, that parties involved are having to start to look at the development of the value propositions that are necessary to allow this implementation at scale. And it's in this creating these value propositions that a lot of the current research in Internet of Things ICT, as it relates to age-friendly homes and environments, is happening. And what I've tried to indicate in this slide is that we see essentially 4 sort of clustered areas of research where a lot of work is happening now. And the most important of these, I think, is the area of user acceptance of privacy and trust and data governance. Because especially in the field of healthy aging, of healthcare, of independent living for vulnerable citizens, this privacy and trust aspect is absolutely crucial. At the same time, we're seeing all sorts of work in advanced big data handling and analysis, in integration and platforms and standard development that actually allow all these different technologies and applications to talk to each other and work together. And as I said, in business and finance models and socio-economic impact analysis necessary to persuade both public sector authorities and private sector actors, business actors working in the aging domain, this sort of technology is worth implementing. So, Internet of Things, in terms of current work in ICT-based age-friendly environments, is very much the coming thing, and one we need to keep in focus for the coming years. Another established area is accessibility, obviously. And in terms of what accessibility actually means and implies, well, I think we know, essentially. We know about door widths, we know about threshold-free houses, we know about turning circuits for wheelchairs. We definitely don't need any new norms and standards. We've got plenty of them as we speak. So in terms of the basic questions, accessibility is an established field. And so you see that research and innovation in accessibility is starting to take up other issues. And a very interesting issue in this is investment and the ownership of investment. You may recall that I started my talk saying that increasingly age-friendly homes are a responsibility of either the homeowners themselves or local level public and private sector actors. And that means that where they can, citizens are being asked to invest in the accessibility and age resilience of their own homes. And this is creating some interesting problems because overwhelmingly people either aren't interested or not motivated to do that particular kind of investment. And also the financial sector and the insurance sector don't have the kind of financial products that will allow people to take out loans to actually do this. We see in the financial sector, in Germany especially, some interesting initiatives where a private bank is working together with the federal government to implement and execute a loan and grant scheme specifically designed to help people not yet in the age bracket that we're talking about, so people in the 30s to 50s, to take out loans on favorable conditions, specifically to invest in the age friendliness and the accessibility of their homes. That is talking about the relatively simple problem of getting the affluent part of the population to invest in the age friendliness of their own homes. An even more interesting and problematic topic in investment research at the moment is what sort of public and private investment models will allow public authorities, social housing operatives to invest sensibly in improving the accessibility and age friendliness of housing in areas of low socioeconomic status. So that's one area where we see accessibility informing sort of the financial and investment research agenda. Also, there's a drive in innovation to see how we can, I said before, there's any number of standards and guidelines already in operation, how these could be harmonized across different countries in Europe to allow the construction sector to allow ICT businesses to scale up solutions and develop to generate growth and jobs through investment in improving the accessibility of the European housing stock, because overwhelmingly the European housing stock is not of the level of accessibility that you would need to house an aging population. Well, accessibility construction in new builds is an area where we know what we're on about. It gets a little more interesting in terms of construction innovation if you look at what sort of techniques and technologies could be implemented to make it possible to improve the accessibility of the existing building stock across Europe. And that also generates research and discussion on how you can compare trade-offs on the one hand between minimum standards and feasibility of investment on the one hand, and what will be acceptable minimum standards from the user perspective on the other. And obviously we see accessibility issues moving outward from the home towards the outdoor environment and public spaces. So those are the sort of new issues in the established areas of ICT and accessibility. At the same time, you may have been alarmed recently to see reports in the media saying that sitting is the new smoking, that we've been neglecting a major impact on our health while we were sitting down at our desks. Well, this may be somewhat alarmist. It demonstrates that as a researcher, the first thing you need to get in order is your press release package. It is true, there's a solid and growing body of evidence that sedentary behavior is linked with both short-term and long-term adverse health effects. And there's a growing research community with the Strategic Sedentary Behavior Research Network being the prime platform working in this field. And at the moment, a lot of groundwork is being done in terms of taxonomy and folksonomy development to get a structured grip on what this field is actually about. At the same time, from the behavioral and lifestyle research domain, we see in healthcare that a lot of research is being done, clinical research, into functional training. Perhaps not surprisingly, it turns out that if you train and prepare patients, vulnerable patients especially, physically and mentally before they undergo a major procedure, in orthopedics, but also, for instance, in cardiac surgery, that you get fewer complications, you get fewer resurgeries, and generally better health and well-being outcomes. That often goes by the name of better in, better out and similar initiatives. What we're also seeing is that these functional training insights, which originated in the healthcare field, are being applied to other domains like home life. I think both of these research drives are informed by the proposed redefinition of health proposed by Machteld Huber and others in, I think, what's already a fairly famous article published in 2011, where they said that you should formulate health as the ability to adapt and self-manage. And the authors know that this could be a starting point for a fresh 21st century way of conceptualizing human health with a set of dynamic features and dimensions that can be measured. But altogether, I think research, and this applies to age-friendly homes and outdoors, is moving towards a more dynamic activist research paradigm. And that coping ability and the harnessing of residual skills are gaining in importance in terms of what sort of outcomes you're trying to reach by research and innovation. Now I just realized that in the presentation I sent to you, I deleted a slide I shouldn't have. So I'll try to talk to you about it. Going down, if you apply these sorts of insight of functional training, of harnessing, of coping ability, and apply them to the design of homes, there's a couple of things that start to get interesting. Traditionally, we've seen, for instance, in accessibility, that we've tried to take away obstacles take away thresholds, install stair lifts, and so on to make sure that people don't can stay living in their homes as their ability to move around decreases. Recent research, I think, is reformulating the question into should we adapt the home or should we try to adapt the functional profile of the people actually living in it? Asking the question is answering it in that current research is moving more towards the latter approach. And if you take that approach, then is it a better idea to install a stair lift or to make sure that you have monitoring systems in place and you provide functional training and encouragement for people to keep using the stairs safely as they grow older and develop impairments? Another interesting insight, if you take this particular approach, is if you look at the introduction of e-health and telemedicine applications into the home, there is quite interesting research having been done a couple of years ago at the Technical University of Enschede in the Netherlands. It seems to imply that rather than taking healthcare out of the care out of the hospital, you're introducing the hospital into the home, in that people start seeing their own home environments as medical environments if you introduce too much medical technology, and start exhibiting the sort of hospitalized behavior in their own homes that is normally associated with healthcare environments. Moving on to public spaces. This is a slide that is actually there. This coping-oriented research and innovation agenda has its implications on the design of public spaces. Again, traditionally, if you look at creating living environments for vulnerable people, older people, or other vulnerable people, then traditionally this is centered on creating sheltered environments and bringing services into the home, ICT-based or otherwise. Whereas the insights currently, and I think we'll see a lot of that in Sophie's presentation, is that if you want to keep people active and happy and in a good state of well-being, they need to get out. They need to find outdoor environments that are both attractive, that invite them to use them, and that help them and invite them to have a meaningful social and physical activity pattern. So in the design of public spaces, things like accessible green zones, varied views, routes, not just accessible routes, but also routes that are meaningful and that coincide with the interests and needs of the older people using them, gain in importance in terms of design efforts. Now, in implementing public spaces that are more attractive and more meaningful to older people, there's quite a urban and rural planning innovation challenge that awaits us. Because as I said in the beginning, our current living environments have been built on paradigms that are no longer very useful for the 21st century demographic challenge. Essentially, we're stuck with a fairly dismal inheritance of post-World War II urban and rural planning, where we have seen districts being developed along monofunctional paradigms, either business or shopping or leisure or domestic, with no combinations of functions, where we've seen the rise of the suburbs, where in the 50s and 60s especially, housing has been designed as quick fixes for shortages rather than with any view to the long term, and where we have seen inner city districts being emptied of population. I've struck up a few scary examples from Dutch city design. These are taken from the city of Zoetermeer in the western Netherlands, which was essentially developed more or less from scratch from the 1960s and 70s onwards. And for people who are listening in from the UK and being rather glib, well, you thought of Milton Keynes, so don't be too proud. So this finding ways to cope with this inheritance of post-World War II planning is, I think, the main challenge in urban and rural planning solutions to designing more attractive living environments, more attractive public spaces. And the innovation agenda, I think this is when I started to run out of time to do interesting slides, so this looks a bit boring. The innovation agenda is dominated by issues of offering better fits to all the citizens' needs and interests, to create social and economic value from redevelopment, because this is a very important condition to make sure that urban planning innovation actually gets implemented. Rural areas are an interesting planning domain. How can we handle depopulation and prevent social, cultural, and economic decline by smart investment in infrastructure in thinly populated areas? And a very important topic is how can we, can we do to marshal the potential of the living environment, both physical and social and virtual, to promote self-help and combat social isolation. Because social isolation is one of the main problems in city life today. It's a growing problem, and it coexists in a vicious circle with other problems. It's both associated with depression and bereavement and low education, and it tends to exacerbate problems in terms of depression, illness or impairments, and diminished well-being generally. So it's a major factor in adversely affecting the health and well-being of especially the older city populations. And in some cities it stands to look rather like an epidemic. We had in the city of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, where a recent survey found that more than half of the population over 65 reported some degree of social isolation. So it's both a major problem and an interesting research challenge, because there are various research directions, and we see these being taken up at the moment, how combinations of social innovation, of ICT-based innovation, and of informed investment in the actual physical living environment can help to combat social isolation and support the emergence of self-help and informal social networks. And so we see research into smart social connectivity, into initiatives to marshal citizen networks at street and neighborhood levels, in creation of collective awareness platforms and other ICT-based social platforms to engage all the citizens. Also in the creation of physical meeting and co-creation spaces to support this social agenda. Early warning and signaling systems are very important, especially for public authorities. And we see who can use these early warning and signaling systems also to provide more smart and proactive public services. And we see a lot of research being done into the social investment business cases that need to be set up in order to successfully implement these sorts of solutions. Because these business cases, and this is where I move to my final topic, are quite complicated. Causal relations in age-friendly homes and outdoors are complex. You generally try to implement innovation in multi-stakeholder environments. Investment needs are large and public sector pockets tend to be shallow. And problems are further exacerbated by the fact there's always no common concept of what costs and benefits actually are. And and this is why we touch upon the Internet of Things and big data agenda, the causal relations are so complex and the data sets are so heterogeneous that traditional analytical models fall short to explain and predict the effect of policy measures, and also the influence of the local implementation context on the success or otherwise of innovation in age-friendly homes and outdoors is only poorly understood. So we see a lot of research work currently being done on evidence and prediction models and policy support instruments to help public and private actors at the local level gauge beforehand the probable effect of investments in age-friendly environments and to, as it were, develop evidence-driven policies in this field together. So, one of the things that we're very important to as a base for successful innovation in co-creative environments is proper impact assessment. And so it's not a coincidence that part of the work of the AFE INNOVNET project has been in developing an impact assessment framework, which we call the SEEIT, to help public authorities primarily in gauging the impact and making socio-economic impact informed decisions on what sort of innovation and policy in age-friendly homes and others they're going to pursue. Nearly there. In the end, what we're looking at in terms of the long-term age-friendly homes and outdoors agenda is the research question how this could be integrated successfully into the broader smart city context. How decisions, how evidence on age-friendly homes and outdoors can be integrated into city operating systems, into smart and integrated city services. Essentially, if you want to take a long view, perhaps this is going even beyond Horizon 2020 timelines, you're looking at age-friendly homes and outdoors as an integral component of a health and all policies, local policy framework. That's a long-term view. Now, to round off my talk, going back to what's cooking in Brussels at the moment and what are the issues on the short and mid-term agenda. Well, you'll find that these are informed by two things. One, as you may know, there is an EFE, an active and healthy aging, and that has come up with a scaling up strategy, because one of the key issues at the moment in active and healthy aging for the European Commission is how can we use that agenda to stimulate economic growth and the creation of new jobs. It's no coincidence that the DGs grow and connect are the ones pushing hardest this particular agenda. And at the same time, we see that the European Commission has facilitated the emergence of an alliance for Internet of Things innovation, which includes large private sector players, research communities, and public sector actors. And together they have come up with an agenda to stimulate investment in smart living environments for aging well, to stimulate growth and jobs. There have been various consultation events on that over the past month, and those have resulted in a short-term innovation agenda looking at technology, construction issues, at financial incentives and procurement. And I promise you something you could get your teeth stuck into in a funded way if you feel like it. The first thing you might want to be looking at if you want to get cracking in this particular field, I think one of the first results of this drive by the European Commission is that there are going to be a number of large call for proposals for large-scale pilots in appliance of Internet of Things technologies to various policy domains. One of these pilots is a pilot on smart living environments for aging well, which carries a 20 million euro budget. And the calls, I think, should be open somewhere during the next month. So if you want to get your teeth stuck into smart, age-friendly homes and outdoors developments and the ICT agenda in the short run, this is something you may well want to be looking at. That concludes my talk. I think if you want to take the long view or the short view, you always need to remember that whatever your living environment, you yourself are probably the smartest thing in it. So make sure to keep your mind in shape. Thank you.
Thank you, Menno. So we'll go now to the second presentation. Sophie, I will upload your presentation.
Thank
you.
Great.
Manchester. The floor is yours now, Sophie.
Thank you, Mina, and thank you, Nu, for inviting Manchester to present today. Today I wanted to talk to you about creating age-friendly outdoor spaces and buildings from the Manchester perspective, which is the UK's first age-friendly city officially. We've relatively recently rebranded ourselves as age-friendly through the Age Friendly Manchester programme. We're actually a program that's been around for a long while. We used to run as the Valuing Older People Partnership for over 10 years now, kind of pioneering a lot of work around aging in the cities before kind of the age-friendly movement really took off. And I think maybe the kind of core things that have really interested us is pushing the idea of actively involving older people in reshaping their cities. So bringing older people into the heart of the kind of local government agenda. But also, I think we are very interested in working with partners, universities, researchers, designers, architects, and students to think about how we might develop cities that are more age inclusive and age friendly. So today I wanted to talk about Manchester's work in the age friendly domain of outdoor spaces and buildings. But I wanted to give some examples, but at first talk a little more conceptually about our age-friendly approach and to set the scene, because I think there's often a lot of a particular way of thinking about age-friendly outdoor spaces and buildings where it's understood as a given, but through our different projects and publications, like the Alternative Age-Friendly Handbook, we've taken a particular view on what age-friendly practice might mean in the context of outdoor spaces and buildings. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that first. So I think our approach is, like I said, the product of an interesting mix of working methods. A lot of the projects and schemes that we work on emerge out of interdisciplinary research. We work closely with the University of Manchester, and this both informs our evidence-based policy making, but it's also a way of us kind of being able to support and test out new ways of working. So, for instance, we've done a lot of research work where we've actively involved older people as co-researchers in investigating the age friendliness of certain neighbourhoods. And this is really interesting, new kind of research. We also have these close working relationships where we work with architecture schools, for instance, that have led to a lot of imaginative studio-based student design projects that we've tested out across the city, through to kind of working with architects on full-scale urban design projects, again, tested out in different parts of the city. And one of the key approaches in all of this is the idea of project pilots and working within neighborhood-based projects. And in a sense, this kind of follows the New York City model of building one age-friendly neighborhood at a time, so working incrementally from neighborhood to neighborhood. And then there are, of course, those kind of basic principles and kind of structures of engagement that informs our kind of age-friendly Manchester approach. So we have an age-friendly Manchester board of local older residents who call the programme to account, and through regular board meetings. We had one the other week. We have an annual forum of over 200 older residents from across Manchester who are able to feed back on the age-friendly Manchester agenda. And we also have, interestingly for this domain, an age-friendly Manchester design group. And this brings interested older residents. They may be architects, designers, or they may simply be design kind of enthusiasts, together with local authority officials and partner bodies to talk about age-friendly design issues. So maybe age-friendly parks or design projects that are happening in the city, as a way of helping to shape the age-friendly Manchester approach. So those structures and basic principles of engagement, I think those are kind of key to the approach. Like all policymakers, we talk about our work in terms of evidence-based policy making. This is no different for the domain of outdoor spaces and buildings, where we've kind of set out a lot of our kind of thinking and research and evaluation framework for age-friendly cities that we co-produce with the UK Urban Ageing Consortium. And as part of this framework, we ask the question, what do we know about aging in the urban environment? What's the particular take on this? What are our priorities as a city? And what are those key issues that we keep on needing to remind ourselves of? And there are maybe three particular issues that we're particularly mindful of. One is what's called the amplification of impact. So essentially, our growing sensitivity to the urban environment as we grow old. I think it was Sheila Peace, the academic, who coined this term amplification of impact. But basically, what it describes is that kind of rather strange way in which we start to become more sensitive to ordinary features of the outdoor environment as we grow old. The pitch of a curb, a threshold, even the particular phasing of a traffic light that, maybe 2 or 3 years ago might not have had an effect on us at all. And the research consortium IDGO have done a lot of work around this area, but it demands from designers and from practitioners a real sensitivity and attention to detail. So thinking about those kind of micro scale concerns of the pitching of a pavement that we might not otherwise think about. I think the second thing that we keep on having to remind ourselves of is our alienation from urban surroundings as we grow old, how key our sense of connection and belonging to a place is to getting about, and to think about what are those things that kind of inhibit our drive and desire to get out and about. So we see this with the fear of crime, issues around safety, but there may be a more fundamental set of more abstract concerns that can kind of create a sense of alienation, a feeling of exclusion from our environment. So in one sense, you can talk about how, and this is true of Manchester, how the infrastructure and the broad kind of corporate narrative of the whole city is oriented to a working age demographic. So it's not about, creating a city that is kind of friendly for older people. That isn't its overriding narrative, and that's something that needs to be addressed. There's that other way in which older people are often excluded from planning and consultation strategies, particularly in areas of regeneration. And then there's that sort of less concrete way in which kind of urban environments are bound up with a sense of identity, self, and belonging. And there are ways in which we're emotionally bound to spaces that can inhibit our ability to get out and about. So, one example is the loss of a partner that may create in yourself a kind of emotional unsteadiness that makes it difficult for you to get out and about. And that has nothing to do with the built fabric in a sense. But there are other ways in which, for instance, an uncared for urban environment, a place that isn't very well maintained, can inhibit your use of a space. It can make you feel unsafe, insecure. So those, I think, are important things to keep in mind. And lastly, then, the issue around kind of the value of public spaces. There's a lot of constructive work that designers and community-based workers can achieve in terms of giving value to public space, rather than always seeing age-friendly design as a practice of mitigation, designing out crime initiatives, or thinking of design as damage limitation, designing out falls. What if we start also to think about urban practices and creative strategies that can amplify your use of public space? Those are kind of things that we've started to kind of think about in Manchester. I think the more typical way in which we can think about the domain of outdoor spaces and buildings as a rule tends to be, through the kind of familiar issues of inclusive design, creating accessible environments, amenable environments, providing public facilities, and kind of linking into the active and healthy aging agenda. And you can see this kind of being played out in a more standard approach towards age-friendly design. So thinking about design as a problem-solving approach, where you identify problems, barriers, and needs, you prototype design solutions, you create design recommendations, and then you implement those design standards that aren't necessarily context-specific. And all of this is really around the idea of moving from resistant to a supportive environment, and kind of dealing with the kind of physical fabric of the environment itself. But there are other ways of approaching age-friendly design which can seem less tangible, but which address desires and needs in different ways, in ways that a more standard design approach can't. So I think thinking about creating age-friendly outdoor spaces and buildings means more than simply fixing or altering the physical fabric of the environment according to design standards, and it involves giving value and weight to people's subjective perceptions of place, acknowledging the relational value of certain kinds of spaces, the way in which spaces can be programmed to become more convivial, recognizing how place affects a person's identity, but also acknowledging those conflicts and tensions in the shared use of space, I think, which often gets glossed over in conversations around inclusive design. So for us in Manchester, I think this kind of framework can be kind of distilled into kind of three main principles in terms of what our approach is. One is kind of thinking beyond the physical, and this may seem a little paradoxical, but thinking about the age-friendly debate on outdoor spaces beyond simply adapting the kind of physical fabric of the built environment, and asking instead what kinds of programs, policies and initiatives might be developed to get together with older people to support and encourage older people to feel more confident in getting out and about. I think we have this over-invested belief that interventions and alterations to the physical fabric will result in an increased use of space. But there are other kinds of temporary urban interventions or program uses of space that can challenge and provide different ways of using space. And we have this recently published age-friendly handbook that kind of provides examples of that from both within Manchester but from across Europe. The other issue that we kind of focus on is the idea of creating a practice of active intervention. So thinking about small-scale actions and interventions that take place on the ground within a given neighbourhood, and to really focus on the kind of action and production of space rather than focusing on specific issues like mobility, safety, and being very kind of context specific instead. And then I think the last point to raise is the idea of kind of experimenting with a range of different approaches, testing those out and involving a range of different actors. So thinking about age-friendly design, not simply as the realm of architects, planners, designers, but involving researchers, artists, community groups, a whole range of different people within a given neighbourhood. And thinking about what we can also learn from quite a lively and kind of emerging scene of design practice that starting to think about different ways of using design to encourage people to lay claim and have ownership of their urban surroundings. So in practice, this means a number of other ways in which you might start to think about age-friendly design. These may involve temporary interventions, participative design processes, flexible use of space, retrofitting, making use of what already exists. And the kind of small example here is maybe an easily overlooked kind of age-friendly practice that Manchester has actually been running for the last 5 years. And it's essentially a club night for 50-plus-year-olds, my generation, where every couple of months a nightclub in Manchester opens its doors to a different age group. And in a sense, you know, in one sense, this is simply just a lot of fun, but in another sense, it's a way of challenging the age-segregated uses of public use spaces. You know, it's a way of questioning the stereotype that nightclubs and the vibrant club scene of Manchester caters only to a particular demographic. So that's one example of a sort of fairly small-scale intervention, but that has kind of a kind of symbolic value also within the outdoor spaces and buildings context. There are a number of other projects from Manchester that I was going to sort of just touch upon briefly, I think four projects in total. Another small-scale project here, again, building on this idea of working through small-scale interventions and the idea of borrowing space, making flexible use of a space that already exists, and trying to devise ways of building more convivial social structures within a neighbourhood. This is Take a Seat, a project in Old Moat, South Manchester, that mirrors the community toilet schemes that maybe some of you in the UK are familiar with, where local authorities worked together with local businesses, shops, restaurants, pubs, where they kind of made a pledge to make their toilets free and accessible to use by the general public when there aren't enough publicly available toilets. Here, the Take a Seat project is essentially providing a publicly available seat, again, in the absence of enough benches along the high street. And it's a very simple idea of being able to borrow a chair to sit on. Shops in the local neighbourhood commit to providing any passerby with a place to sit on their presence, not having to buy anything in the shop. And essentially what happens, a shop signs up to the local A20 charter, puts a sticker in the shop window that signals you're welcome to come in and take a seat if you need rest. No obligation to buy anything. In one way, this is a project that fills the gap in public provision, lack of funds to provide enough public benches, or scenarios which happens quite frequently where benches have been removed because of antisocial behaviour. But again, the Take a Seat project is not just about providing a seat in the absence of publicly available seats. It's also a way of trying to encourage a more convivial social infrastructure within the local neighbourhood, so that you have a place to stop and chat as much as take a rest, and create a neighbourhood that in a sense is somehow more hospitable. Now into sort of age-friendly parks, which is a slightly larger project. And this has involved the Age-Friendly Manchester programme in helping inform the redevelopment of Alexandra Park. Older people have kind of been actively involved in reimagining the parks for themselves, and the role of the Age-Friendly Manchester programme has really been in ensuring that the existing redevelopment of the park includes and involves older people's voices, informing kind of the design of the larger scheme. And I think this is particularly important in a context where older people often feel quite alienated from the public space of a park, reluctant to use it, not just because of physical problems of access, but those kind of less tangible worries about safety, or that there's nothing in the park that feels like it's for them, doesn't feel like they have ownership of the park. So what is an age-friendly park? So there are existing definitions of age-friendly parks, including the age-friendly Philadelphia Parks checklist. So again, I think the emphasis has often been too much a focus on adapting the physical features of, the park space. And this is something that Age-Friendly Manchester has been trying to shift a little, and to define the age-friendly park via a different approach. So yes, thinking about the physical design of the park itself, the type of seating, lighting, toilets, the quality of the pathways. But our main focus has been really kind of thinking through the engagement of older people in the design and redevelopment of the park, involving older people in programs of activity that are on offer in the park. So thinking about the use of space and a public space as a program space, not just a physical object, and thinking about the ongoing management of the park. I think those issues have been really key in the redevelopment of age-friendly Alexandra Park. And I think the other thing to mention within this is that there's no sort of blueprint for action in this, so that this initiative is very context driven, and what the Age-Friendly Manchester team are offering beyond Alexandra Park is the offer to support other neighbourhoods in developing their own age-friendly parks through design expertise, facilitating workshops, guidance on community engagement, connections to groups of older people in areas near the parks, and providing access to kind of research, but simply kind of offering that support in different neighbourhoods, so that as in New York, you start to build an age-friendly neighbourhood, one neighbourhood, or city, one neighbourhood at a time. A more extensive project has been the age-friendly Old Moat project, a project essentially investigating the age-friendliness of a particular neighbourhood in the south of Manchester. So this is a project that was commissioned by a housing provider, Southway Housing, and it's the product of a collaboration between architects, social scientists, community development and urban design. It's both a research project as well as part of Age Friendly Manchester's programme to create a series of age-friendly neighbourhoods across Manchester. I think what's particularly interesting about this project is the way in which it maps out the age friendliness of a neighbourhood on a series of maps domain by domain. And it uses a combination of spatial data analysis as well as a participative design process of community audits, walking diaries, focus groups, workshops. And through these maps, it's able to kind of visualize how each separate domain, so transportation, social participation, or social inclusion, how these are all played out on the ground and in relation to each other. You know, how kind of social participation plays out on a particular street, how it affects community facilities or the public spaces of the area. And essentially demonstrates that you can't have an age-friendly practice that simply engages with the domain of outdoor spaces and buildings, but that you need to engage spatially with all of the age-friendly domains. And so what this kind of project has ended up with is quite a rich overlay of data on maps that kind of make visible, often quite kind of anecdotal data and subjective perceptions about place, alongside the kind of more rigorous census data and qualitative data of the research findings. And I think what's interesting is the way that these maps can make visible experiences that are often not formally represented. So, for example, on one of the maps, it demonstrates how the number 179 bus provides a kind of social space, an informal resource as much as simply a transport service for getting A to B. And that's kind of been revealed through the kind of anecdotal stories that people were talking about, how the bus was actually their kind of social space as much as a transport route for them. Ultimately, I think the project ended up with a neighbourhood plan that doubled up as an action plan, a kind of series of actions and next steps across all the domains. And you know, these might include things like actions to address the particular steep incline on a proposed new route on one part of the estate, but it might also include actions to establish a resident-led partnership to promote the involvement in the management of certain spaces. So what you end up with is an action plan that's not just an external view in on things, a kind of a map drawn up by an architect, but that you have a map that emerges both from an extended process of consultation and that informs then citywide as well as kind of local neighbourhood strategy. And I think that the value in this action plan is that there's a kind of spatial precision to it, so that each action, each particular point is anchored to a particular location, which makes the prospect of action and change more likely and accountable to kind of the local residents within the neighbourhood. One of the key actions from that Old Moat research project included option to investigate how to diversify housing stock and increase provision of specialist housing within the Old Moat area. And this has led into a kind of broader project around exploring with the Age Friendly Manchester Design Group the idea of the Age Friendly home. And so we have a kind of current project going on that's about addressing the lack of choice for older people who may want to downsize, who might need accommodation with support, or who may want to kind of live in a specially adapted property. So currently there's a kind of process going on with the age-friendly design group and Southway Housing to consider a number of different options within the Old Moat area around kind of higher density developments, converting houses to multi-story flats, whether or not there's kind of scope for creating small enclaves of existing houses with the addition of kind of older person specific annexes, considering options around co-sharing and home share schemes, as well as thinking about the kind of material and technological improvements that can encourage people to stay in their own homes for longer, as well as thinking about those improved informal support networks that can also enable people to stay in their own homes for longer. We're currently kind of looking at what an age-friendly home might look like through a series of workshops and consultations, asking what do older people think about their existing own homes, what ideas and concerns do they have about their changing housing needs in their future homes. But there is a very specific focus to the project that I think is quite interesting, and the project will be based on a semi-detached house, which is a particular housing type widespread across England and within Old Moat as well. So the project kind of has application beyond the neighbourhood itself. The semi-detached house is usually a 3-bedroom family home, many with poor thermal standards. So there's kind of scope for retrofitting and improving performance there. But there's also interesting challenges in terms of size and scale, thinking around the adaptation of these homes around those kind of issues of home sharing, extension, subdivision, and retrofitting. These are all issues that come into play. And again, they kind of come back to those ideas of the kind of flexible use of space, thinking around ideas of retrofitting, sharing, and kind of drawing on informal social structures as well through the idea of home share and so on, to allow people to stay in their homes for longer. I just wanted to end the kind of talk with a slide around structures of engagement, just because this is so key to the age-friendly Manchester approach. Sorry, excuse me. And it kind of really runs through all the outdoor spaces and buildings projects that we have. There are, of course, many kind of processes and structures of engagement, and these can vary from top-down statutory consultation processes through to kind of more innovative methods that really embed design groups for within broader local authority programs. On a symbolic level, these engagement structures are really important because they provide a platform and voice for what is an otherwise marginalized age group, but they also offer practically structures and collaborations that can lead to new designs, actions, and initiatives. So, for instance, we have the Age-Friendly Manchester Design Group that has that allows older people to kind of actively interact with civic structures, and to do this beyond the more normal kind of structures that older people are involved with, those kind of access forums that kind of tend to limit the discussion around age-friendly design to issues of accessibility. It's also a way of empowering older people to actively engage with what are often quite opaque planning processes. So that's why these structures of engagement are key. We also have kind of processes, other forms of kind of engagement, of involvement that have shaped our projects, that have been informed by the research community and the design world. And I think it's really important to kind of learn from these other kind of disciplines and professions where, emerging forms of practice around co-design, where kind of they use different methods, can also start to inform, the design and approach that a local authority has to outdoor spaces and buildings. So as you know, with design processes, there's a kind of whole palette of engagement processes that it's kind of important to think about within an age-friendly context. They shape age-friendly projects in different ways, and they can work from strategic influencing, kind of informing citywide policy, to ground level participation that informs very closely the local shape of projects on the ground. And I think that diversity of involvement and engagement is really key when we're kind of thinking about the design of age-friendly outdoor spaces and buildings. I was going to end it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie and Menno. So we have a couple of questions now. So if you're ready to answer them. The first is from CVAEICE. They have a question regarding the Old Mount neighborhood. So could you give a few words about how it was funded? And if you have, oh yeah, I don't know. And there are EU programs. Menno talked about, let me get his presentation again. There was some calls, there will be some calls for the pilots projects. There you go, smart living environments for aging. Well, I think, Menno, if you have a couple of words about these Horizon 2020 calls, maybe it could help that person to get more information about EU programs that could help them to turn age-friendly cities.
Yes, absolutely. I think also it's important that we also refer the question to Sophie for her to give some insight into how these funding mechanisms work on the local level, because you have to put your trust in either national or European funding programs for research and innovation. That still doesn't have you implementing age-friendly environments successfully. But in terms of Horizon 2020, in the new work programs, I think the main call for cities interested in working with industry, with the entire value chain on large-scale implementation of ICT-based age-friendly environments. And this particular call on large-scale pilots for smart living environments for aging is one you're going to have to look at. I think the definitive drafts have been published by the European Commission on their website, on the participant portal. I think it's just as an item for new. We may usefully put up a link on the AFE INNOVNET website in the news and funding possibilities section. Alternatively, if you're looking at national funding, well, my short answer is you should know better than I do. If you're looking at other European possibilities in terms of funding programs, then either the regional development funds as they pertain to your own country and region. If you're in a Euregio zone, then you could look at the Euregio Interreg programs now being implemented. And for cities in the, let's say, lower income section to the European Union, the structural funds programs may offer some possibilities to include these kinds of infrastructural developments. I think the first round of programs for the structural funds have been approved or not, as the case may be, and are being implemented. But there should be, I think, a second round in 2016 and 2017. But again, I would like to hear from Sophie how this funding issue has been dealt with in a more practical way, because in the end you need to look at the local context and see how you can make it financially sustainable there.
Yeah, I think the way that Manchester's been able to operate quite effectively is having this way of working with external partners. I think that is key. So a lot of the work, and I think there was a question around how the Old Moat project was funded. The majority of that funding came through the collaboration with the university, and that was through a kind of big research project. I think it was through the ESRC, but a collaboration with the University of Manchester and the Architecture School there, where there was this kind of funding in place to have a extended research, community-based research process that then allowed for the time for all the kind of community involvement, data analysis, and thinking around the kind of action planning that came out of the Old Moat project. So I think for Manchester, particularly in a climate of quite severe funding cuts for local authorities, I think the only kind of way forward at the minute is to have these kind of close working relationships with external partners, and having the involvement, for example, of kind of committed housing providers within a given neighbourhood who have an interest in kind of thinking about how their neighbourhood, how their housing stock can be made more age-friendly, simply because of the kind of demographic within that area.
Thanks, Sophie. There was another question related to your slide. Let me check slide number 6. When it comes to other ways of approaching age-friendly designs, it says recognizing ways in which a place affects a person's identity. Anna would like to know what you mean by, well, how did you cope with that?
Yeah. I think this is a kind of more a kind of broader statement around how, typically when we think about age-friendly design for outdoor spaces, if we simply focus on the kind of physical fabric and implementing design standards, that we never get into that kind of other issue around how, as we grow old, places, for example, particularly in places of rapid regeneration, you can often feel quite alienated from the surroundings, or even thinking about issues where, like I was talking about, the idea of bereavement, losing people, these less tangible, senses of our self, where we kind of feel kind of more unsettled, that inhibits us from getting out and about. And I think the way of sort of addressing that, if not solving it, is to have kind of projects that really engage with people on the ground. So rather than starting from the from the kind of more abstract position of implementing design standards, to have that involvement on the ground through community engagement structures, where you can really find out what people's kind of everyday kind of experiences are, and then to move on from there. I think that's the way we would approach it. I mean, I don't think there's a sort of a one-size-fits-all solution for this kind of thing, but it's more about a kind of recognition that you need to work on the ground and listen to people's kind of everyday concerns that may be around kind of, those familiar issues of access, but they may be more to do around, issues of, isolation or worries, where, thinking around then, issues around what kind of informal social networks and structures of support can you start to create that can give people that confidence to get out and about. I think that's the sort of way we would look at it.
Okay. There are no more questions, but I had one. When I usually talk about age-friendly environment to local practitioners and local politicians, they would ask me, but we have other generation to take care of. We don't only take care of older people. So what could you, is there an example of that shows that age-friendly environments for the outdoors and buildings doesn't concern only older citizens, but also the other generations? Do you have any examples or showing that it really is a benefit for other people.
I mean, it can be taken on different levels. I mean, I suppose you could take a project like the Take a Seat initiative in Manchester that is very much focused on older people needing a place to rest. But first of all, it's not just older people who need a place to rest. Sometimes, it can be pregnant women, other people who are just feeling a bit exhausted. And on a more general level, there is something nice about creating, structures within a local neighbourhood that are more sociable, more hospitable, more convivial. And I think that's maybe again, something that's interesting to think about how, being supportive of one age group, you can also create neighbourhoods that are more open and more supportive of the neighbourhood and community as a whole.
Yeah. The handbook that you use for the presentation, is it available online, or do we have to?
Yes, it should be, and I'm will try and find a link for you that maybe I can send to you later. But it should be available both through the University of Manchester website, so the MICRA, MICRA, and it's also available through the RIBA, which is the Royal Institute of British Architects. But I'm sure if you Googled alternative age-friendly handbook, you would find a link, but I will send a separate link.
Thank you. One last comment. We had a workshop in June about age-friendly environments that could help active and healthy aging, where a speaker said that public health departments and architectures didn't work very well together, but it seems in Manchester the collaboration is quite successful. Where with this old mode neighborhood. Do you have any secret, or maybe you could share this good experience with the Netherlands? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know what the secret. I think the part of the secret is, like I was saying before, that we have these good working relationships with, the universities and the architecture in schools. Particularly, there's a lot of energy that design students in particular have, and they're very eager kind of to work within neighborhoods. So the idea of kind of being able to kind of pilot, test out, maybe even start off with smaller student-based experimental projects. I think it just has an energy and a vitality to it that I think is fairly infectious. So maybe that's been part of the secret, that that you kind of can draw on the kind of energy of architecture schools.
Yeah.
Okay.
Manu, do you have any comments to give?
Yeah, can I just add to that, just to show that we're not completely backward in terms of architecture in the Netherlands. We've got a proud tradition. I think traditionally public health and architecture, more broadly urban design, have been in different silos, both blissfully unaware of the relevance of their work for the other silo. Luckily, we're seeing in some cities in the Netherlands now, the big cities, notably Rotterdam, The Hague, and Amsterdam, a growing awareness that the everyday living environment, including the physical environment, does have an effect on public health and well-being. So we're seeing slowly things that are being integrated into public health policies, albeit very slowly, but there's a start. Conversely, we're also seeing the National Dutch Architectural Institute starting to take an interest in, as it were, sustainable and citizen-oriented urban redevelopment as an agenda. And in fact, a special professor of urban design and architecture for public health was appointed last year at the University of Groningen. The agenda is developing, but I think it needs to be recognized that they're coming from very different worlds, and they're really slow. It's still very much a first date sort of relationship.
Okay. So there's still work to do to get out of these silos and start a good partnership and collaboration with every kind of department, I guess. Okay, so we have the link there. I will make it public on the website for the handbook. If there are no more questions, may I know if you have any comments? Sophie, if you would like to add another final tip for maybe other cities to be more age friendly, it's now or never.
No, I think I'd just kind of reiterate this issue around kind of working with external partners, that it really kind of helps both raising funding, but also kind of giving kind of fresh ideas and fresh approaches. I think that for us has been really helpful.
Okay. And I hope you do share your experience with other cities and other regions, for example, or how does it work?
How does it work? Well, we do. We've been involved in helping set up a UK-wide network of age-friendly cities, so we do that regularly. And we also can do that through different portals. So I know we do that through, for example, the kind of World Age-Friendly World Health Organization portal, sharing kind of best practice through that. But again, we're always kind of interested in hearing from other cities and kind of sharing ideas informally. So if people want to get in touch, then we're always keen to kind of hear.
All right. Well, thank you very much to both of you, and I wish you to have a nice day.